The snow came down sideways across the Wyoming Territory Road on the 11th of December, 1878, and it swallowed the stagecoach tracks behind Josephine Caro's boots within 100 yards. She was 24 years old, carrying a carpet bag with $11 sewn into the lining and a marriage contract folded in her coat pocket, and beside her, gripping her sleeve with both hands, was her 17-year-old sister Ruth, who had stopped being able to feel her own fingers somewhere near the second-mile marker. The driver, a stocky man named Cobb Duggins, had turned the coach back at Miller's Ford when the horses refused the drifts, swearing the two women would be safer waiting in town for the squall to pass. Josephine had not waited. She had looked at the letter in her pocket, the one that said a man named Nathaniel Hollis would meet them at the Larkspur Hollow Depot by 4 o'clock, and she had decided that 4 o'clock was a promise she intended to keep, storm or no storm, because promises were the only currency she had left. By the time the light went the color of dishwater and the wind found the seams of her coat, both sisters believed, without saying it aloud to each other, that they might freeze on that road, 2 more names added to a county register of people the winter had taken. What they found instead, an hour past dark, was not death but the glow of a lantern swinging low and fast toward them, carried by a man on a big roan horse who had ridden out 3 separate times that afternoon against his own hired hand's advice, refusing to let 2 unmarried strangers die on his account. If this story has warmed you already, tell us in the comments which town or ranch you're watching from tonight, and press like if you mean to see Josephine Caro's story through to its end. Nathaniel Hollis found the sisters a half-mile past the Cutler Creek Bridge, huddled in the lee of a boulder that Josephine had spotted through the whiteout, dragging Ruth behind her because Ruth had begun, in the particular slow and dangerous way of the very cold, to say she only wanted to sit down for a minute. Josephine had refused to let her sit. She had slapped Ruth's face once, hard, an act she would remember with something like shame for years afterward, even though it had likely saved her sister's life, and had kept walking with her arm locked under Ruth's shoulder until the boulder gave them a windbreak and she could go no farther. It was there that Nathaniel's lantern found them, and it was there that Josephine got her first look at the man she had crossed 1,100 miles to marry, broad through the shoulders, perhaps 34 or 35, with a beard going prematurely gray at the jaw, and eyes that took in the 2 women, the carpet bag, the state of Ruth's hands, all in the space of a few seconds, before he said only, "Can you ride double?" not as a greeting but as a question that needed answering fast. Josephine said yes. She had never in her life ridden a horse, but she said yes, because the alternative was admitting a truth that might cost them the last hour of daylight they had, and Nathaniel Hollis did not ask her to prove it before he lifted Ruth up first, wrapped her in the wool blanket he'd tied behind his saddle, and then reached down for Josephine with a grip that did not waver even though she came up onto the horse clumsy and heavy with cold and fear. The ranch house at Split Rock, when they finally reached it past 7 o'clock, was low and long and built of hewn logs chinked with clay, with 2 windows glowing amber against the dark, and a plume of chimney smoke that the wind kept trying to flatten. Nathaniel's hired hand, a wiry, weathered man of perhaps 50, named Tom Yarrow, had kept the stove roaring and a pot of beans and salt pork simmering since noon on Nathaniel's instruction, and it was the smell of that pot, more than anything else that night, that told Josephine she and Ruth were not going to die in Wyoming Territory after all. Ruth cried when she saw the fire. Josephine did not cry, not then, because crying was a thing she had trained herself out of, somewhere around her 16th year, back in Springfield, Massachusetts, when her father's debts had first come to light, and someone had needed to be the one who did not fall apart. She helped Ruth out of her wet boots and stockings with hands that had gone from numb to a deep, aching burn, and she accepted a tin cup of hot coffee from Tom Yarrow with a nod that was meant to be gratitude and probably looked, she realized later, more like suspicion. Nathaniel Hollis did not sit with them by the fire. He tended to the horses first, unsaddling and rubbing them down and seeing them fed before he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, and only then did he finally look at Josephine Caro properly, in lamplight, without a storm between them. "You're smaller than I pictured," he said, which was not a compliment and not an insult, only an observation, delivered the way a man might note the weather. "Your letter said you kept your father's accounts for 6 years." "I did," Josephine said. 14 years old when I started, 20 when the business closed." "And your sister?" He looked at Ruth, wrapped in a quilt now, color returning to her cheeks in blotches. "Your letter didn't mention a sister." "My letter didn't mention a great many things, Mr. Hollis," Josephine said, and she watched him take that in, watched something behind his eyes shift from wariness to a kind of grim, tired amusement, as though he had expected exactly this, and was almost relieved to have it confirmed rather than delayed. "Ruth has nowhere else to go. Our mother passed in the spring. I wrote to you honestly about everything that concerned the arrangement between us. My sister's welfare was never part of that arrangement, and I intend to see to it myself, whatever that requires." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Tom Yarrow, ladling beans into 2 bowls at the stove, glanced over his shoulder once. Then he said, "There's a second room off the back. Used to be for a hired girl my late wife kept. It's small, and it's cold in the mornings, but it's a room." He did not say more than that, did not offer sympathy or make a show of generosity, and Josephine understood, even exhausted and half-frozen as she was, that this was simply how the man spoke, in decisions already made, stated plainly, without decoration. She thanked him. He nodded once, the way he'd nod at a fence post that had been properly set, and went back out to check the barn door was latched against the wind, leaving the 2 sisters alone with Tom Yarrow, the fire, and the first hot meal either of them had eaten in 2 days. That first night, lying in the narrow bed in the small cold room with Ruth's breathing evening out beside her, Josephine took stock of what she had and what she had left behind. She had left behind a house in Springfield that no longer belonged to her family, sold at auction 8 months prior to satisfy the last of her father's creditors after his death from a fever that everyone privately understood had been hastened by shame and drink. She had left behind an aunt, Beatrice Pruitt, who had taken in Ruth out of duty rather than affection, and had made it clear, in the particular cold arithmetic of people who resent an obligation, that the arrangement could not continue past Ruth's 18th birthday. She had left behind, too, a man named Wendell Pruitt, her aunt's nephew by marriage, who had proposed to Josephine the previous winter with an expression on his face that had less to do with love than with the fact that her father, before his fall, had once owned 400 acres in the Connecticut River Valley that Wendell's family had wanted for 2 generations. Josephine had refused him. She had refused him twice, in fact, the second time in front of witnesses at her aunt's dinner table, and it was that refusal, more than the debts or the shame, that had made Springfield a place she could no longer imagine living out her days in. She had answered Nathaniel Hollis's advertisement, placed, she later learned, by a matrimonial correspondence agency out of Cheyenne on behalf of widowed ranchers seeking practical wives, not romantic ones, because it had offered the one thing nobody else had, distance, and a claim to make of her own life whatever she was capable of making. She had not told Nathaniel about Wendell Pruitt. She had not told him either about the leather portfolio at the bottom of her carpet bag, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, containing her father's old surveying notes and a geological pamphlet on limestone and coal seams that she had read so many times the pages had gone soft at the corners, a private education she had built for herself in the 2 years after the business failed, when she had nothing left to do with her evenings but read what her father left behind and try to understand exactly how a man could lose everything without ever once, in his ledgers, admitting he was losing it. She fell asleep with the wind still working at the corners of the house, and she did not dream, because she had also trained herself out of that. The wedding took place 4 days later, on the 15th of December, in the front room of the Split Rock house, with Tom Yarrow and the town's Justice of the Peace, a heavy-set, kindly man named Orson Pratt, as the only witnesses besides Ruth. There was no white dress. Josephine wore her best gray traveling dress, brushed clean of trail dust, and Nathaniel wore a clean shirt and the same boots he wore every other day, and the ceremony took 11 minutes from start to finish, after which Judge Pratt shook both their hands, accepted a cup of coffee and a slice of the dried apple pie Ruth had helped Tom bake that morning, and rode back to town before the light failed. Josephine did not cry at her own wedding, and neither, she noted, did Nathaniel show any particular emotion beyond a kind of settled relief, the look of a man closing a ledger on a transaction he had needed to complete. That night he showed her to the room that would now be hers, his late wife Eleanor's room, still holding a cedar chest and a framed photograph on the wall that he did not take down, not then and not for a long while after, and told her plainly that he did not expect false affection from her, only fair dealing, and that he would try to offer the same in return. Josephine told him that fair dealing was the only promise she had ever intended to keep. It was not romantic. It was, she thought, lying awake again with the house settling around her, something better suited to the two of them, an agreement between equals who had both been burned once and did not intend to be burned twice. The Split Rock Ranch, Josephine learned over the following weeks, ran 1,100 head of cattle across 9,000 acres that stretched from the Cutler Creek bottomland up into the dry benches beneath a formation the local Shoshone and the white settlers alike called Widow's Table, a long, flat-topped ridge of pale rock that threw a shadow over the north pasture every afternoon in winter. Nathaniel Hollis had built the operation up over 12 years, first with his father's small herd, and then, after his father's death and his own marriage to Eleanor, by buying out 2 failing neighboring claims during a hard winter that had broken half the ranchers in the county. Eleanor had died 3 winters back, in childbirth, along with the infant, and Nathaniel had run the ranch alone since, with Tom Yarrow and, depending on the season, 2 or 3 hired hands who came and went with the branding and the roundup. He was not a man who spoke of Eleanor easily, and Josephine did not ask him to. What she did instead, in her first weeks at Split Rock, was watch. She watched how the household accounts were kept, which was to say barely kept at all, a cigar box of receipts, a running tally in the back of Nathaniel's cattle ledger scratched in pencil, no accounting of feed costs against calf weights, no tracking of which hands were paid what or when. She watched how the pantry was stocked, haphazardly, with flour and salt pork bought in town at whatever price the general store's owner, a narrow, watchful man named Silas Dunmore, chose to charge that week. She watched Ruth, still pale and thin from the frost that had nearly taken her, begin to find her feet in small chores, gathering eggs, mending, learning to bake bread under Tom Yarrow's surprisingly patient instruction, and she watched herself, too, taking stock of a body and a mind that had spent 6 years managing a failing business and now had, for the first time, a solvent one to manage instead. She began with small things, the way anyone careful learns to move in a new house without breaking anything. She reorganized the pantry by weight and use, rather than by whatever shelf had been closest when a sack was carried in. She began keeping her own private tally, in a notebook she had brought from Springfield, of what feed cost per head against what the calves brought at the spring sale the previous year, information she gathered simply by asking Tom Yarrow careful, unhurried questions over the wash basin in the evenings, questions that did not sound like an interrogation because Josephine had long ago learned that people told you everything you needed to know if you only let them believe the conversation was about something else. She learned that Nathaniel had lost nearly $400 the previous autumn on a shipment of cattle sold too cheap and too fast because he had needed cash before the note came due at the Larkspur Hollow Bank, a note held by a man named Horace Dunmore, Silas Dunmore's older brother as it happened, the two of them together holding a fair portion of the town's commerce and credit between the store and the bank. She learned that the note was renewed each year at a rate that struck her, when she finally saw the paper itself in early January, as considerably steeper than what she recalled from her father's old business dealings with banks back east, though she said nothing of this yet to Nathaniel, filing it away instead the same careful way she filed everything else. Christmas came and went quietly at Split Rock, marked by a modest goose that Tom Yarrow shot down by the creek and a length of red ribbon Ruth found in her trunk and tied, with great ceremony, around the neck of the barn cat. Nathaniel gave Josephine a pair of proper winter gloves, lined with rabbit fur, purchased on his last trip to town, an unspoken acknowledgment of the hands he had seen turn raw and cracked from the cold and the work she had quietly taken on without being asked. Josephine gave him nothing, having arrived with almost nothing to give, and felt the absence of a gift more sharply than she expected to, though Nathaniel did not seem to notice or mind. It was a small kindness, the gloves, but Josephine understood it as data as much as sentiment. The man paid attention, noticed what was needed before it was asked for, and did not require gratitude performed loudly in order to give it. She filed that away too. January brought the hardest cold of the winter, weeks where the thermometer nailed to the porch post did not climb above 0 even at midday, and it was during this stretch that Josephine first revealed, in the smallest possible way, the education she had been keeping folded in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk. Nathaniel had ridden out one gray morning to check on a bull that had gone missing from the north pasture, and had come back 2 hours later, grim-faced, saying the animal had broken through the ice on Cutler Creek and drowned before anyone could reach it. A loss of nearly $60 at market, a sum that mattered a great deal to a ranch already carrying debt to the bank. Josephine, without being asked, took down Nathaniel's ledger that evening and worked through the winter feed costs by lamplight while he sat across the table pretending to mend a bridle, and by the time she finished, she had found, buried in 6 months of scattered figures, a pattern that suggested the ranch was overpaying for grain by nearly 8 cents a bushel compared to the going county rate, likely because Nathaniel had never had cause or time to compare Silas Dunmore's prices against the mill in the next town over. She said nothing dramatic about it. She simply turned the ledger around, pointed to the figures with the end of her pencil, and said, "If you bought your grain through the cooperative mill in Cheyenne Wells instead of through Dunmore's store, you'd save close to $40 over the winter, maybe more once you account for the freight." Nathaniel looked at the numbers for a long moment, then looked at her, and something in his face, not quite surprise, more a recalculation, the look of a man revising an estimate upward, settled into place. "You did all my father's books," he said, not quite a question. "I did," Josephine said, "and I balanced them every month for 6 years, and I could show you where he made his mistakes too, if you wanted to know how a business fails from the inside." Nathaniel did not answer that directly, but the following week, without announcement, he handed her the cigar box of receipts and the cattle ledger both, and said only, "Might as well have someone competent looking at these," and walked out to the barn before she could see whatever expression had prompted the words. Ruth, meanwhile, was finding her own footing in a manner entirely different from her sister's. Where Josephine watched and calculated, Ruth simply asked questions of everyone she met, artless and open in a way that Josephine sometimes worried would get her taken advantage of, though it more often won her friends. She had taken quickly to Tom Yarrow, who had no children of his own and treated her, within a month, with the gruff affection of an uncle, teaching her to whittle, to identify tracks in the snow, to bake a passable sourdough starter she named Gerald, for reasons she never fully explained. She had also, on her first trip into Larkspur Hollow proper to fetch mail and supplies, made the acquaintance of a young woman named Cora Beeman, whose father ran the livery stable, and the two had become fast friends within the space of a single conversation about horses, a friendship that would prove more consequential than either girl understood at the time, since Cora's father heard everything that passed through his livery and repeated a good portion of it to his daughter over supper. It was through Ruth's easy friendship with Cora, in fact, that word first reached Split Rock, in late January, that a stranger had been asking after a woman named Josephine Caro at the stage depot in Cheyenne, a man who had shown the depot clerk a photograph and said he was looking for his intended bride. Josephine did not tell Nathaniel about this immediately. She sat with the knowledge for 2 full days, turning it over the way she turned over a column of figures that did not balance, trying to determine whether Wendell Pruitt's presence in the territory was coincidence, persistence, or something with sharper edges to it. She had refused him twice and left the state without a forwarding address, and she knew enough of Wendell's temperament, and more particularly of his family's temperament regarding property they believed themselves entitled to understand that his arrival in Wyoming was very unlikely to be either accidental or well-intentioned. She decided, on the 3rd day, that fair dealing required telling her husband the truth, even a truth she would rather have buried with the rest of Springfield. And so on a cold evening in early February, with Ruth already asleep and the fire burned down to coals, she told Nathaniel Hollis the whole of it. Her father's failed business and his death, the 400 acres in Connecticut that had once made her a prospect worth pursuing, Wendell Pruitt's proposal and her double refusal of it, and the very real possibility that the man now asking after her in Cheyenne intended to make some manner of claim, whether on her hand or on whatever he imagined she still possessed. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his expression giving away little, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "You didn't have to tell me that." "I know," Josephine said. "I told you because you ought to know what might come knocking, and because I intend for there to be no secrets in this house that could hurt you or Ruth if they came out sideways instead of straight." Nathaniel nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Then I appreciate it," he said, "and for what it's worth, Mrs. Hollis, I don't much care what a man in Connecticut thinks he's owed. This is my land and my name, and you're my wife under both, and that's the end of any claim he thinks he's got." It was the first time he had called her Mrs. Hollis without a trace of formality in his voice, and Josephine found, to her own surprise, that the words settled something in her chest she had not realized was still unsettled. By the middle of February the days had begun, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen, and Josephine had settled into a rhythm at Split Rock that felt, for the first time since her father's business collapsed, something like solid ground beneath her feet. She kept the ranch's books now in earnest, in a new ledger she had ordered through the mail from Cheyenne with her own small savings, ruled into columns for feed, wages, veterinary costs, and sale proceeds, and she had begun, cautiously, to draft a plan for the spring that would see the ranch buy its grain through the Cheyenne Wells Cooperative rather than through Silas Dunmore's store. A plan that would save real money, but that she understood, even as she wrote it out, was likely to draw exactly the kind of attention from the Dunmore brothers that a new bride with no standing in the community could least afford to invite. Josephine's first real encounter with Silas Dunmore came on a bright, bitter morning in late February, when she rode into Larkspur Hollow alone for the first time, driving the ranch's flatbed wagon behind a pair of mules named Biscuit and Clay, to purchase seed and a length of stovepipe, and more quietly, to inquire after grain prices at the cooperative mill 2 doors down from Dunmore's general store. Silas Dunmore was a narrow man in his 40s with pale, watchful eyes and a habit of totaling a customer's purchases twice, the second time always a few cents higher than the first, a habit Josephine noticed within her first 5 minutes in his store and said nothing about, filing it away as she filed everything else. He greeted her with the particular oily warmth of a man greeting a new source of income. Mrs. Hollis, he said, drawing out the name as though tasting it. We'd heard Nathaniel had gone and got himself a bride from back east. Bookkeeper's daughter, they say. Josephine allowed that this was true. Well, Silas said, running his eyes over her plain traveling dress in a way that made his one fixed trait, a grasping, transactional greed that treated every person as a ledger line to be maximized, plain even in that first conversation. I do hope you'll find our prices fair. We extend generous credit to good customers. Josephine thanked him, purchased only the seed and stovepipe she had come for, paid in cash rather than accepting the credit he pressed on her twice, and walked the 2 doors down to the cooperative mill, where she learned that grain there ran a full 9 cents a bushel cheaper than Dunmore's price, exactly as her arithmetic by lamplight had predicted. She placed a modest order, small enough not to draw attention on its own, and rode home satisfied in a way she did not yet let herself examine too closely. It did not take long for Silas Dunmore to notice the absence of the Hollis account from his ledgers. Within 2 weeks he had ridden out to Split Rock himself, ostensibly to inquire whether Nathaniel needed anything for the spring branding, though Josephine understood within moments of his arrival that his true purpose was to take the measure of the new Mrs. Hollis and determine whether she represented an inconvenience worth addressing. He found her in the yard, sleeves rolled to the elbow, helping Tom Yarrow mend a section of corral fence, and he made no effort to hide his surprise, nor, Josephine noted, his disapproval. "Ranch work, Mrs. Hollis?" he said, dismounting slowly. "I'd have thought a woman of your education would find better use of her hands." "I find good use of my hands doing whatever wants doing," Josephine said, not pausing in her work. "Same as anyone out here, I'd imagine, Mr. Dunmore, yourself included." Silas's smile thinned at that, and he pivoted, as men of his particular greed always did, to the matter of money. He had heard, he said, that the Hollis Ranch had taken its grain business elsewhere this season, and he wanted Mrs. Hollis to know that he could match any price she'd found in Cheyenne Wells, if only she'd give him the chance. Josephine looked at him then, directly, and said that she appreciated the offer, but had already committed the season's order, and that perhaps next season, if his prices were competitive from the outset, rather than only after he stood to lose the business, she would consider it. It was a small exchange, conducted entirely in the mild, practical language of commerce, but Josephine watched Silas Dunmore ride away with his jaw set, and she understood, with the particular clarity she reserved for numbers and for people who behaved like numbers, that she had made an enemy of a small, grasping sort, the kind who did not forget a lost sale, and who had, moreover, a brother at the bank who held the note on the very land she now called home. Horace Dunmore proved, when Josephine finally met him in March, a different species of the same animal. Where Silas's greed was petty and immediate, counted out in bushels and pennies, Horace's was patient, institutional, and dressed in the language of prudent banking. He ran the Larkspur Hollow Trust and Savings from a brick building that was, quite deliberately, the only brick building in town, and he wore a gold watch chain that he consulted often and unnecessarily, a habit meant to convey that his time was valuable and a visitor's was not. Josephine met him first when she accompanied Nathaniel to the bank to discuss renewing the note on the ranch, a visit she had suggested herself, having by then reviewed 3 years of the loan's terms and found the interest calculated, she was almost certain, in a manner that favored the bank more heavily than the paper's own stated rate should have allowed. She said nothing of this suspicion in that first meeting, choosing instead to watch and listen while Nathaniel and Horace discussed the renewal in the broad terms men of business used with each other, but she asked, near the end of the conversation, in a tone of polite and faintly ignorant curiosity that she had learned long ago disarmed men who underestimated her, whether the compounding on the note was calculated monthly or annually. Horace Dunmore's watch chain stopped moving for a moment. "Monthly, Mrs. Hollis," he said, "as is standard for a note of this size and risk." "Of course," Josephine said, smiling, and let the matter drop entirely, though she had gotten the answer she came for, an answer that, set against the actual figures printed on the note itself, told her that Horace Dunmore's bank had been compounding at a rate that would have raised eyebrows in any counting house back east, quietly extracting perhaps $60 to $80 a year more from the Hollis account than the note's stated terms should have permitted. A discrepancy she suspected was not unique to Nathaniel's loan, but rather a fixed trait of Horace's calculating, entitled approach to every note his bank held on every struggling ranch in the county. She said nothing to Nathaniel yet. She wanted the actual paper in front of her, every renewal since the note's origin, before she made an accusation that could not be walked back. The third of the town's antagonists revealed herself with rather less subtlety than either Dunmore brother. Agatha Higgins was the widow of a former postmaster and had appointed herself, in the years since his death, the unofficial keeper of Larkspur Hollow's moral ledger, a role she executed with an entitled, orgulous suspicion of anyone whose circumstances did not match her own narrow expectations. She had heard, within days of Josephine's arrival, the bare outline of the story. A mail-order bride from the East arrived in a snowstorm with a younger sister nobody had mentioned in advance, and had spent the following months turning that outline over in conversation at the church social, the dry goods counter, and the weekly quilting circle, embellishing it each time with a fresh shade of suspicion. By March, the version of events circulating through Larkspur Hollow, thanks largely to Agatha Higgins, held that Josephine Caro had likely fled some scandal back east, that her sister's presence was proof of a family too disreputable to be trusted, and that Nathaniel Hollis, grieving and lonely, had been taken in by a scheming woman who meant to get her hooks into his land. Josephine first encountered this directly at the March quilting circle, which she attended at Ruth's gentle insistence that she ought to make some effort at friendships in town, and where Agatha Higgins greeted her with a smile so thin it barely qualified as one. "Mrs. Hollis," Agatha said, loud enough for the room to hear, "we were just remarking how quickly you and your sister found your way out here, all the way from Massachusetts, with no family to speak for you. Must have been quite a rush to leave." Josephine met her eyes steadily. "It was a rush, Mrs. Higgins," she said. "My mother had just died, and my sister had nowhere else to go, and Mr. Hollis offered us both a home. I'd have thought Christian charity was something this town valued, but perhaps I misunderstood." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a barb has landed somewhere it was not expected to land, and Agatha Higgins's smile did not so much fade as calcify, but she said nothing further that afternoon, though Josephine understood the war, such as it was, had only properly begun. Ruth, for her part, encountered a milder but no less pointed version of the town's suspicion through her friendship with Cora Beeman, whose father, though a decent man, was not above repeating the gossip that passed through his livery, and who mentioned to Cora one evening that some in town wondered whether the elder Caro sister had married Nathaniel Hollis for his land rather than any genuine regard, a rumor Cora, mortified, immediately relayed to Ruth so that Ruth could warn Josephine before it caught her unprepared. Josephine thanked her sister for the warning and told her, with more calm than she entirely felt, that she had been called worse things by better people back in Springfield, and did not intend to spend a single hour of her new life defending herself against a town that had not yet bothered to learn her name properly. Privately, though, she understood the danger such talk represented, not to her feelings but to her position. A community's good opinion, or lack of it, could determine whether a bank extended patience on a note, whether a neighbor helped during a crisis, whether a marriage was seen as legitimate or merely convenient. She began, without announcing it to anyone, to make small, deliberate efforts to be seen doing good in the community that owed her nothing yet. Mending a torn quilt for the church's charity auction with stitches so fine that even Agatha Higgins was forced to admit, grudgingly, that the girl had a skilled hand, and sitting up 2 full nights in April with a neighboring family's youngest child through a bout of scarlet fever, using remedies she had read about in her father's old medical almanac, a small act of care that would matter a great deal more, in ways Josephine could not yet foresee, before the year was through. The first letter from Wendell Pruitt arrived at the Larkspur Hollow post office in the last week of April, addressed not to Josephine directly, but to Mrs. Josephine Caro Hollis, care of any who might know her whereabouts, a phrasing calculated, Josephine understood the moment she read it, to invite exactly the kind of curious speculation among the postmaster and his customers that would make her position in town more difficult. She read it standing at the counter, aware of the postmaster's careful lack of interest, and found it exactly as unpleasant as she had expected. Wendell wrote that he had learned of her marriage with great sorrow, that he could not believe she had truly meant her refusal of him, that he had come west on business of his own, he did not specify what business, and would be passing near Larkspur Hollow before summer, and that he hoped she would receive him as an old family friend, if nothing more, given all that their families had once meant to each other. He closed by mentioning, in a single sentence that Josephine read 3 times to be certain she had understood it correctly, that he retained certain documents relating to her late father's estate that he believed she would wish to discuss privately, before matters became, as he put it, unnecessarily complicated for all parties. Josephine folded the letter into her coat pocket with hands that did not shake, rode home, and that evening showed it to Nathaniel without editing a word of it. Nathaniel read the letter twice by lamplight, his jaw tightening with each pass, and when he finished he set it down on the table with a care that Josephine understood was costing him some effort. "What documents would he mean?" Nathaniel asked. "Relating to your father's estate." Josephine considered the question carefully before answering, because she had spent the ride home turning it over herself. "I don't know for certain," she said, "but I suspect it's a bluff, or nearly one. My father's estate was settled at auction. There's little left to document beyond what the court already has on record. But Wendell's family kept close accounts of every dealing they ever had with mine, going back 2 generations, and it's possible he holds some old paper, a promissory note or a boundary agreement, that he means to twist into something it isn't, simply to give himself a reason to insert himself into my life again." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "And if it isn't a bluff? Then we'll deal with whatever it is honestly, the same as we deal with everything else," Josephine said, "but I won't be frightened into secrecy by a man who couldn't accept a plain no the first 2 times he heard it." Nathaniel nodded slowly, and then, in a rare gesture that surprised her more than any words could have, reached across the table and covered her hand with his own for a moment, brief and rough-palmed and entirely without romantic pretense, before withdrawing it to say only, "He won't get past the front gate without going through me first." It was not a declaration of love. Josephine understood it, nonetheless, as the closest thing to one that Nathaniel Hollis was likely to offer, and she found she did not mind the shape it had taken. May brought the first real test of the season, a dry spring following a light winter that left Cutler Creek running low and the north pasture browner than it should have been by that point in the year, a pattern that old-timers in the county, including Tom Yarrow, muttered darkly, might presage a genuine drought summer, the kind that came once a decade and broke ranches that had run too close to their margins. Josephine, reviewing the ranch's feed reserves against her carefully kept ledger, calculated that if the dry pattern held through June, Split Rock would need to either sell off a significant portion of the herd early, at whatever price the market offered, or purchase supplemental hay at a cost the ranch's thin cash reserves could ill afford, especially with the banknote's next annual renewal falling due in September. She raised this with Nathaniel over supper, laying out the numbers plainly, and watched him absorb the weight of it with the particular stillness he reserved for bad news that could not be argued away. "We've weathered dry years before," he said, though without much conviction. "Not with a note held by Horace Dunmore renewing in the same season," Josephine said, "and not, if I've read the weather right, one this dry this early." She did not yet mention her suspicion about the compounding interest on the note, wanting to be entirely certain of her arithmetic before she made an accusation against a man who held considerable power over their future, but she began, that same week, sending careful letters to a cousin of her father's, still working as a clerk in a Boston counting house, a distant connection she had maintained through occasional correspondence, asking him to confirm, discreetly and through channels that would not draw attention, what the standard and legal method for calculating compound interest on a note of this type actually was in the territories, and whether a bank could lawfully alter its compounding schedule without formal notice to the borrower. June arrived hot and dry as feared, and with it came Silas Dunmore's second attempt to draw the Hollis Ranch's business back to his store, this time through a subtler and more damaging avenue than grain prices. Word reached Josephine, again through Cora Beeman's father at the livery, that Silas had been telling customers around town that the Hollis Ranch was having trouble making ends meet this season. A statement vague enough to avoid outright slander, but pointed enough to seed exactly the kind of doubt that could make suppliers less willing to extend credit and neighbors less willing to lend equipment or labor during Roundup, should Split Rock need either. Josephine understood immediately what was happening. Silas Dunmore, having lost the grain business, was working to make the ranch's position appear weaker than it was, perhaps hoping to pressure the Hollises back into dependency on his store's credit, or perhaps simply exercising the small cruelty of a man who did not forgive a lost sale. She did not confront him directly. Instead, she made a point of paying, in full and in cash, for every purchase the ranch made anywhere in town that month, and of mentioning, in casual conversation with anyone who would listen, the ranch's plans to expand its herd in the fall, a modest exaggeration of confidence calculated to counter Silas's whispers with a display of solvency that she made certain reached the same ears his gossip had reached. It was in late June, during the driest and most anxious stretch of that summer, that Josephine finally received the reply from her father's old Boston connection, a letter that confirmed what her own arithmetic had already strongly suggested. The compounding schedule printed on the original 1874 note between Nathaniel Hollis and the Larkspur Hollow Trust and Savings specified annual compounding, not monthly, and any bank that had altered this to monthly compounding without formal written notice, and the borrower's signed consent had done so, at best, through an irregularity that a territorial court would very likely view unfavorably, and at worst through something considerably closer to outright fraud. Josephine read the letter twice, then a third time, at the kitchen table with the summer heat pressing against the windows, and felt something settle into place inside her that was not quite triumph and not quite fear, but a sharpened, focused clarity she recognized from the worst months of her father's collapsing business, the feeling of finally understanding the true shape of a problem after months of only sensing its edges. She did not act on the information immediately. She wanted the original note itself, the physical paper with its original terms, compared side by side against every renewal Horace Dunmore's bank had issued since, before she brought this to Nathaniel or to anyone else, because an accusation half proven against a man as powerful as Horace Dunmore, in a town this small, could do more damage unproven than the wrong itself had done. The drought worsened through July. Cutler Creek dropped low enough that Tom Yarrow could walk across it in 3 places without wetting his boots above the ankle, and the north pasture had gone the color of old rope, forcing Nathaniel to move the herd earlier than planned to the higher benches near Widow's Table, where a few springs still ran but where the grazing was thinner and the cattle would need supplemental feed sooner than the ranch's stores could comfortably provide. It was during this stretch, with tempers thin and the whole household stretched taut with worry, that Wendell Pruitt finally arrived in Larkspur Hollow, riding in on the afternoon stage on the 9th of July, dressed in a manner that made plain, to anyone with eyes, that he was a man of some means from somewhere considerably more polished than Wyoming territory, and that he had come with the specific and stated intention of calling on Mrs. Hollis at her earliest convenience. Wendell Pruitt rode out to Split Rock 2 days after his arrival, uninvited, on a hired horse he clearly did not know how to sit properly, and Josephine watched him come up the drive from the kitchen window with a calm she did not entirely feel. Nathaniel was in the yard when Wendell dismounted, and Josephine came out to stand beside her husband rather than wait inside, a small, deliberate choice that she made because she wanted Wendell to see, immediately and without ambiguity, exactly where she stood. Wendell removed his hat with an exaggerated courtesy that had always struck Josephine as theatrical rather than sincere, and greeted her by her maiden name before correcting himself with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Josephine, forgive me. Mrs. Hollis, I should say, though it still doesn't sit right on my tongue." "It sits perfectly well on mine," Josephine said. "What brings you 1,100 miles from Springfield, Wendell?" Wendell glanced at Nathaniel, clearly hoping for a private audience, and finding none offered, proceeded to explain, in the roundabout language of a man accustomed to getting his way through patience rather than force, that he had come west partly on family business, and partly, he admitted with a practiced sorrow, because he could not rest easy, knowing Josephine had married a stranger in such evident haste, without family present, without proper courtship, and he felt it his duty, as someone who had known her family for 2 decades, to satisfy himself that she was truly safe and truly happy. Josephine informed him, with a flatness that left no room for misinterpretation, that she was both safe and happy, that her marriage was her own affair and none of his family's business, and that whatever documents he claimed to hold regarding her father's estate could be sent to her by post or handed over now, but that either way this would be the last visit of his she intended to receive at Split Rock. Wendell's composure slipped only slightly at this, a tightening around the eyes that Josephine recognized from their last encounter in her aunt's dining room, the look of a man unaccustomed to refusal, recalculating his approach. He produced, from an inner coat pocket, a folded paper that he handed not to Josephine, but, pointedly, to Nathaniel, a small act of disrespect that Josephine noted and filed away alongside everything else. The paper, when Nathaniel opened it and the 3 of them examined it together in the yard, proved to be an old promissory note, nearly 15 years stale, in which Josephine's father had once borrowed $300 from Wendell's father against the eventual sale of a parcel of the Connecticut River land, a note that had, so far as Josephine could determine from memory, been satisfied in full at the time of the land's sale, years before her father's business ever failed. Wendell claimed the note remained unpaid, that interest had accrued across 15 years, and that the debt, with compounding, now stood at something over $1,100, a sum, Josephine understood immediately, calculated not from any honest accounting, but from whatever figure Wendell judged large enough to be genuinely threatening to a struggling rancher, while remaining small enough that a court battle over it, conducted at this distance and expense, might seem more trouble than it was worth to contest. This note was satisfied, Josephine said, in October of 1872, at the closing of the land sale. I kept the books myself. I can produce the receipt. Then produce it, Wendell said, his practiced sorrow curdling for just a moment into something harder and more entitled. Or my family will have no choice but to pursue what's owed, through whatever means available, including a lien against whatever property you now hold interest in, including, I'd imagine, this ranch. It was, Josephine understood in that moment, exactly the threat she had feared from his first letter. Not a genuine legal claim, which she was confident she could disprove, but the pressure and expense of forcing her to disprove it, conducted in a territory far from where the relevant records were kept, at a moment when the ranch could least afford a legal fight of any kind. Nathaniel, who had said nothing through this entire exchange, folded the note carefully and handed it back to Wendell rather than keeping it, a small gesture that Josephine understood as a refusal to treat the paper as anything more significant than it deserved. "Mr. Pruitt," he said in the flat, unhurried voice he used for settling disputes among hired hands, "my wife says the debt was paid, and I've known her 4 months and never once caught her in an untruth about anything, including things that would have been easier for her to lie about than this. I'd suggest you take your note back to Massachusetts and pursue it through whatever court has jurisdiction there, because you won't find one out here inclined to entertain a 15-year-old claim brought by a man who rode 1,000 miles to deliver it in person instead of through an attorney, the way any legitimate business is conducted. and you'll do it from town, because you're not welcome on this land again." Wendell looked between them for a long moment, weighing, Josephine could see, whether to push further, before he settled his hat back on his head with the same theatrical courtesy he'd removed it with, and said only that he hoped, for her sake, that she wouldn't come to regret her choices, a line so transparently meant to unsettle her that Josephine nearly laughed, despite the tension of the moment. He rode off without further incident, though Josephine understood, watching his back recede down the drive, that this was very unlikely to be the last they heard from him, particularly not with Horace Dunmore's banknote also coming due that same season, and a drought already testing the ranch's margins. That evening, with Ruth safely occupied helping Tom Yarrow salt down a hide in the barn, Josephine made a decision she had been weighing for months, and brought out the oilcloth-wrapped portfolio from the bottom of her trunk, laying it on the kitchen table in front of Nathaniel without preamble. "There's something else you should know about me," she said, "before this year gets any harder than it already is." She walked him through it carefully, her father's old surveying work, done decades earlier for a Connecticut mining concern before he'd ever gone into the dry goods business that eventually failed. The geological pamphlets she'd read and reread until she understood the basic signatures of coal seams and limestone deposits in exposed rock formations. And, most significantly, her own observation, made on her very first ride past Widow's Table back in December, half frozen and barely paying attention to anything beyond survival, that the ridge's exposed strata bore a striking resemblance to formations her father's old notes described as promising indicators of a coal seam, the kind that had, in Connecticut, turned worthless hill land into a property worth 10 times its former value, almost overnight. She had said nothing of this for 7 months, she admitted, partly because she wasn't yet certain enough to risk raising false hopes, and partly, she said, meeting his eyes directly, because she had wanted to be sure of him, of whether he was a man who would see her knowledge as a threat to his authority over his own land, or as an asset to a marriage built on fair dealing. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, turning one of the geological pamphlets over in his rough hands, before he said, "And which have you decided I am?" "The kind who handed me his cigar box of receipts within a month of meeting me," Josephine said, "because he'd rather have the truth of his own books than the comfort of not knowing them. I think you'd rather know what's under that ridge than not, even if it changes things." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Show me," he said, "at first light. I want to see this coal signature of yours with my own eyes, before either of us gets ahead of ourselves." It was not romance, not exactly, but it was something Josephine recognized as its own kind of intimacy, a man willing to stake a morning's ride on the strength of her judgment, without demanding proof in advance. They rode out at first light the next morning, Josephine, Nathaniel, and Tom Yarrow, who Nathaniel had insisted come along both for his knowledge of the land and his discretion, a quality Nathaniel valued in a hired man above nearly any other. The three of them spent the better part of the morning working along the exposed face of Widow's Table, Josephine consulting her father's pamphlets against the actual rock in front of her, pointing out the dark, banded seams running through the pale limestone that matched, as closely as she could determine without formal training, the descriptions of bituminous coal indicators her father had documented decades earlier in Connecticut. Tom Yarrow, who had worked cattle in that country for the better part of 30 years and had ridden past Widow's Table 1,000 times without ever once considering what lay beneath its surface, turned out to have his own useful piece of knowledge to contribute. He recalled, from his own younger years working a brief stint in a Pennsylvania coal town before he'd come west, that miners judged a seam's promise partly by a particular sulphurous smell that clung to certain rock when freshly broken, and when Nathaniel took a pickaxe to a low outcropping at Josephine's direction, the smell that rose from the broken stone was, by Tom's own account, exactly that. It was not proof, not the kind a geological survey company would accept without proper testing, but it was enough, taken together with Josephine's father's notes and Tom's practical experience, to convince all three of them that Widow's Table held something considerably more valuable than grazing land, provided they could determine how to develop that value without losing the ranch to debt or deception before they ever got the chance. The problem, as Josephine laid it out plainly to Nathaniel and Tom that evening, was one of timing and leverage. A coal seam confirmed but undeveloped was worth nothing on paper, and worse, if word of it reached Horace Dunmore or Silas Dunmore before the Hollis family had secured its position, either brother would have every incentive to call the note early, foreclose on some pretext, or otherwise maneuver to acquire the land themselves before its true value became widely known. A pattern, Josephine noted grimly, that was not uncommon in territories where banks held notes on land whose owners did not yet understand what they possessed. The note itself, however, gave Josephine an unexpected point of leverage of her own, one she had been quietly building since June: the discrepancy in the compounding schedule. She had, by late July, finally obtained copies of every renewal of the note since its 1874 origin, requested through Judge Pratt's office under the reasonable pretext of confirming the ranch's own records were accurate, and laid side by side against her father's Boston correspondence confirmation of standard practice. The pattern was unmistakable. Horace Dunmore's bank had shifted the note from annual to monthly compounding sometime in 1876, without any documented notice to Nathaniel, extracting, by Josephine's careful calculation, just over $230 more in interest across 3 years than the note's original terms permitted. Josephine brought this to Nathaniel in early August, laying out her figures with the same calm precision she brought to every column she balanced, and watched him absorb first anger, then a kind of grim satisfaction as the shape of a genuine advantage came into focus. "You're certain of this," he said, though it was not really a question, not after 7 months of watching her be certain of things and proven right. "I'm certain enough to bring it to Judge Pratt," Josephine said, "and I'd guess certain enough that Horace Dunmore would rather settle it quietly than have a territorial judge examine his bank's compounding practices across every note it holds in this county, not just ours." The plan they settled on that night was not a grand confrontation, but a careful, businesslike maneuver, the kind Josephine had learned from watching her father's failures as much as from any success. They would request the note's renewal meeting in early September as scheduled, and Josephine would attend alongside Nathaniel, prepared to present the discrepancy calmly and privately, offering Horace Dunmore a choice between quietly correcting the note's compounding retroactively, crediting the overcharged interest against the current balance, or having the matter brought before Judge Pratt and, if necessary, the territorial banking examiner, a threat that carried real weight given how closely Horace Dunmore guarded his bank's reputation as the more respectable of the two Dunmore enterprises in town. The meeting took place on the 3rd of September in Horace Dunmore's brick office with its heavy walnut desk and its single high window, and Josephine watched Horace's practiced calm falter, ever so slightly, when she laid the comparison of the original note against its subsequent renewals on the desk between them, her figures neat and unimpeachable in the ledger columns she had ruled by hand. "I don't believe this discrepancy was accidental, Mr. Dunmore," she said, "but I'm prepared to believe it was an oversight rather than deliberate fraud, provided it's corrected today, retroactively, with the overcharged amount credited against our current balance, and provided the note going forward reverts to its original annual compounding terms." Horace Dunmore's watch chain went still in his hand. He looked at Nathaniel, perhaps hoping to find a more pliable negotiating partner there, and found instead a man watching his wife's arithmetic with the settled patience of someone who had already seen her proven right too many times to doubt her now. "And if I don't agree to this generous interpretation of my bank's bookkeeping," Horace said carefully, "I take it Judge Pratt would be your next stop." "He would," Josephine said, "along with a letter to the Territorial Banking Examiner's office in Cheyenne, which I've already drafted, though I'd very much rather not have to send it, Mr. Dunmore, because I'd rather do business in this town for the next 30 years without unnecessary enemies. But I will send it, if I have to." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Tom Yarrow, waiting outside with the wagon, would later say he'd half expected to be called in to break up a fight, but when Horace Dunmore finally spoke, it was in the flat, resigned tone of a man calculating that a quiet loss now was considerably cheaper than a public one later. $234, he said, credited against your balance, and the note reverts to annual compounding. I trust we needn't involve Judge Pratt or Cheyenne in a matter so easily resolved between reasonable people. Josephine allowed herself, for the first time in that entire meeting, something like a smile. Reasonable people, she agreed, resolve things quietly. I'm glad we could manage it. The credit against the balance did more than simply ease the ranch's immediate cash position, though it did that too, buying Split Rock the breathing room it needed to weather the last of the drought without selling off the herd at a loss. It also gave Josephine and Nathaniel something they had not had before that meeting, a demonstrated willingness on both sides to resolve disputes through documented fact rather than raw power, a precedent that would matter a great deal in the months ahead when the far larger question of Widow's Table's coal seam came to a head. Word of the meeting did not stay entirely quiet, of course. Larkspur Hollow was too small a town for that, and within a week, a heavily edited version of events had made its way through Agatha Higgins's circle, one in which Mrs. Hollis had gone into the bank and made all sorts of accusations, a framing that briefly threatened to cast Josephine as the aggressor rather than the wronged party, until Judge Pratt himself, who had heard a fuller and more accurate account from Horace Dunmore's own clerk, mentioned at the following week's town meeting, in his characteristically mild way, that he understood the Hollis note had simply been brought into proper order, a phrase carefully chosen to close the matter without either embarrassing Horace Dunmore publicly or leaving Josephine's reputation exposed to further distortion. It was in the weeks immediately following the note's correction that Nathaniel and Josephine, with Tom Yarrow's help, began the delicate work of determining how to develop the Widow's Table coal seam without inviting exactly the kind of predatory attention from outside interests that had nearly cost them the ranch's fair dealing at the bank. Nathaniel wrote, on Josephine's careful advice, to a mining engineer of good reputation in Cheyenne, rather than to any company that might seek to acquire the land outright, requesting a proper survey conducted under contract and confidentiality, a survey that would take the better part of the autumn to complete, but that promised, if it confirmed what Josephine's father's old pamphlets and Tom's sulphurous rock both suggested, to transform Split Rock from a ranch surviving one dry season to the next into a property with resources sufficient to secure its future for a generation. Josephine, for her part, began quietly drafting what she privately thought of as her real project, separate from the coal and separate from the cattle, a plan, sketched first in the back pages of her ledger and then in a dedicated notebook of its own, for what such newfound resources might build in Larkspur Hollow beyond a single family's fortune, a proper schoolhouse perhaps, or a lending library, something that would outlast any single harvest or any single vein of coal, something that would still matter to the town long after she and Nathaniel were both gone. The mining engineer, a careful, soft-spoken man named Elias Whitcomb, arrived at Split Rock in late September and spent nearly 3 weeks tramping the length of Widow's Table with his instruments and his sample bags, and when his final report reached Nathaniel by post in mid-October, it confirmed everything Josephine's father's old notes had promised and more. A bituminous coal seam of workable quality running nearly a mile along the ridge's northern face, not vast by the standards of the great Pennsylvania fields, but substantial enough, Whitcomb's report estimated, to support a modest but genuinely profitable mining operation for 20 years or better, particularly given the growing demand for coal among the railroads pushing steadily westward through the territory. Nathaniel read the report twice at the kitchen table, the same table where Josephine had first turned his cattle ledger around to show him the grain discrepancy 10 months earlier, and when he finished, he looked at his wife with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that had moved past the settled, practical respect of their early months together into something warmer and more openly admiring. "You found this," he said, riding half-frozen past a rock formation in a snowstorm, "on the worst night of your life." "I found the beginning of it," Josephine said. "You're the one who rode out 3 times in that same storm to make sure I lived long enough to find anything at all." It was, Josephine would later think, one of the truer exchanges of their whole marriage, each crediting the other for what the other had actually done, without the exaggeration or false modesty that so often colored such conversations. The decision of how to develop the seam occupied Nathaniel and Josephine through the following winter, and it was here that Josephine's careful nature asserted itself most clearly. Rather than leasing the mineral rights outright to an established mining company, which would have brought faster cash but far less control, or attempting to develop the mine entirely themselves, which their limited capital could not support, they settled on a middle path that Josephine herself proposed after weeks of study, a limited partnership with Whitcomb himself, who had experience managing exactly this scale of operation, and who was, crucially, willing to take a smaller ownership stake in exchange for a guaranteed operating role, giving the Hollis family majority control of a mine that would, once operational, employ a dozen or more local men and pay royalties directly into the ranch's accounts rather than into some distant company's coffers in Cheyenne or further east. The negotiations, conducted through the winter of 1878 into 1879, were long and occasionally tense, but Josephine's 7 years of watching her father's business dealings, both his successes and his catastrophic final failures, gave her an instinct for exactly which terms mattered and which could be conceded, an instinct that impressed even the careful Whitcomb himself, who remarked more than once that he had negotiated with men twice her age who understood their own interests less clearly than she understood hers. The mine began operation in earnest in the spring of 1879, and its first royalty payment, arriving in June of that year, was larger than the entire ranch's cattle income for the previous full year combined, a sum that Josephine recorded in her ledger with the same careful, unshowy precision she brought to every other figure, though she allowed herself, alone in the kitchen that evening, a longer moment than usual simply looking at the number before she closed the book. She did not spend that first payment on comfort, though comfort would have been easy enough to justify after 7 months of a family climbing out from under debt and drought both. Instead, true to the project she had been quietly sketching in her private notebook since the previous autumn, she brought to Nathaniel a proposal that a portion of the ranch's new income, a fixed percentage set aside each quarter, rather than a single grand gesture, be committed to building a proper schoolhouse in Larkspur Hollow, the town's children having until then made do with lessons held irregularly in the back room of the church by whichever settler's wife had the patience and the time that particular season. Nathaniel agreed without much argument, partly out of genuine conviction, Josephine believed, and partly, she suspected with some private amusement, because he had learned by then that arguing with his wife's carefully reasoned proposals rarely ended in his favor. The schoolhouse broke ground in August of 1879, built on a half-acre of land the town donated once it became clear the Hollis family intended to fund both construction and a teacher's modest salary for at least its first 3 years, a commitment that did more to repair Josephine's standing in Larkspur Hollow than any single conversation or confrontation could have managed. Agatha Higgins, who had spent the better part of a year finding new angles from which to view the Hollis marriage with suspicion, found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to either continue her campaign against a woman now visibly funding her grandchildren's education or quietly retreat from it, and she chose, with the particular flexibility of people whose objections were never truly about principle, to retreat, remarking to anyone who would listen that she had always said Mrs. Hollis had more sense than people gave her credit for, a revision of history so complete that Ruth, hearing it secondhand from Cora Beeman, laughed until she had to sit down. Josephine, for her part, extended no particular warmth toward Agatha's reversal, but neither did she hold the grudge. She had learned from her father's failures that resentment carried forward indefinitely was its own kind of debt, one that compounded uselessly and never paid out anything worth having. Beyond the schoolhouse itself, Josephine began, in the winter of 1879 into 1880, a smaller and more personal project that mattered to her, if anything, even more. Teaching bookkeeping in evening sessions held first in her own kitchen and later in a spare room at the new schoolhouse once it was built, to any woman in the county who wanted to learn it, an offering that drew, in its first winter, 6 students, including Cora Beeman, who wanted to help her father manage the livery's accounts more precisely, and a young widow named Prudence Ackerman, whose late husband's small farm she was determined to keep solvent on her own rather than sell to the first man who offered to relieve her of the burden. Josephine taught these sessions the way she had once learned from her father's ledgers, by showing rather than lecturing, having each woman bring her own real figures, a store's receipts, a farm's harvest tallies, a household's monthly expenses, and working through them together until the columns balanced and the shape of a solvent future became visible on the page rather than remaining an abstraction. It was, Josephine reflected more than once during those long winter evenings, the truest use she had yet found for the education her father's collapse had forced upon her, not merely surviving her own circumstances, but teaching other women the same tools that had let her survive them, so that fewer of them would ever need to depend so entirely on a single man's fortune, a single harvest, or a single stroke of luck the way her own family had once been forced to. The ranch itself grew steadily through 1880 and into 1881, the coal royalties funding not extravagance but expansion, of exactly the kind that mattered most. New fencing to bring another 2,000 acres of grazing land into productive use, a proper well dug near the house to end the household's dependence on hauling water from Cutler Creek during dry seasons. And, in the spring of 1881, the purchase of the failing Ackerman farm itself, at Prudence Ackerman's own request rather than through any pressure from the Hollis family, folded into the ranch's operation, with Prudence retained as its manager at a fair wage, a solution that let her keep working the land she loved without carrying the crushing solitary risk of ownership any longer. Tom Yarrow, promoted by then to full foreman over a growing crew of hired hands, took to referring to the whole operation, half joking and half in genuine pride, as the empire Mrs. Hollis built out of a snowstorm and a stubborn streak, a phrase that made its way, as such phrases do in small towns, into general circulation, until even Silas Dunmore, who had never entirely forgiven the loss of the ranch's grain business, was heard to grudgingly refer to Split Rock as the Hollis operation, rather than dismissing it, as he once had, as merely Nathaniel's inheritance with a new wife attached to it. The schoolhouse dedication was set for the 4th of July, 1880, timed deliberately by the town council to coincide with the county's annual Independence Day gathering, an event that drew nearly every family within a day's ride to Larkspur Hollow for a shared meal, a series of speeches, foot races for the children, and, that year, the formal opening of the new schoolhouse, with its bell donated by the Cheyenne Wells Cooperative Mill and its shelves of books purchased with a further portion of the ranch's coal royalties. Josephine had not expected, when she woke that morning, that the day would also bring the last and most decisive confrontation of Wendell Pruitt's long, grasping campaign against her peace. But she should perhaps have anticipated it, she reflected later, given how precisely a crowded public gathering suited a man who had always preferred pressure applied where witnesses could see it rather than disputes settled quietly and fairly. Wendell arrived at the gathering uninvited, as he had arrived at Split Rock the previous summer, though this time he came with a lawyer in tow, a thin, nervous young man from Cheyenne named Percival Adkins, whom Wendell had clearly retained specifically to lend an air of legal legitimacy to whatever he intended to attempt that day. He waited, with a patience Josephine found almost impressive in its calculation, until the schoolhouse dedication speeches had concluded and the crowd had begun to disperse toward the tables of food set up under the cottonwoods, and it was there, in front of perhaps 60 townspeople, including Judge Pratt, Horace Dunmore, Agatha Higgins, and nearly every family whose children would soon fill the new schoolhouse's desks, that Wendell Pruitt approached Josephine and Nathaniel with his lawyer at his side and announced, in a voice pitched carefully to Carrie, that he had come to formally serve notice of a lien against the Split Rock property, based on the still unresolved promissory note from Josephine's father's estate, a lien he claimed his attorney had already filed with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne that very week. The crowd's attention, which had been drifting toward lemonade and cold chicken, snapped fully back to the small tableau forming near the schoolhouse steps, and Josephine understood, in the single beat of silence that followed Wendell's announcement, that this was precisely the public spectacle he had engineered, calculating that she would either be too flustered by the audience to respond effectively or too proud to want the dispute aired publicly at all, and would therefore be more willing to settle quietly and expensively simply to make him go away. He had, however, badly miscalculated the woman he was dealing with. Josephine did not flush, did not stammer, did not ask to discuss the matter privately. Instead, she reached into the small bag she had, with characteristic foresight, brought to the dedication that morning, precisely because she had never fully trusted Wendell Pruitt to let the matter rest, and produced a folded document of her own, the original 1872 receipt for the Connecticut land sale, showing the promissory note in question satisfied in full, obtained months earlier through careful correspondence with the very same Boston clerk who had confirmed the bank's compounding irregularity, along with a notarized statement from that clerk attesting to the receipt's authenticity. "Mr. Pruitt," Josephine said, her voice carrying easily in the outdoor stillness, pitched to match the deliberate volume he had chosen for his own announcement. "You're welcome to file whatever you like with the Territorial Land Office, but I'd ask Judge Pratt, since he's standing right there and since he's the nearest thing to territorial authority we have present today, to examine this receipt and tell this gathering whether a debt satisfied in 1872 can lawfully support a lien filed in 1880. Judge Pratt, visibly reluctant to be drawn into what was clearly a family dispute conducted as public theater, but recognizing his role once directly appealed to, took the document, examined it along with the notarized statement, and pronounced, in his mild, unhurried way, that the receipt appeared entirely in order, that any lien filed against a satisfied debt would very likely be dismissed the moment it was formally examined by the Land Office, and that he would, as a courtesy to all parties present, be sending a copy of this receipt to the Cheyenne Land Office himself that same week to forestall any confusion. Percival Adkins, the young lawyer, went visibly pale at this development, understanding perhaps better than his client the professional embarrassment of having filed a lien on a claim so easily disproven, and could be seen, in the minutes that followed, attempting to have a hurried, low-voiced conversation with Wendell that Wendell seemed determined to ignore. Wendell, cornered now in front of the very audience he had hoped to use as leverage, made one final attempt to salvage the moment, turning to the gathered crowd with an appeal to sympathy rather than law. "I only ever wanted what was fair," he said, "and to see that Josephine was truly cared for, out here so far from everyone who's known her since she was a girl." It was Nathaniel, who had said almost nothing through the entire confrontation, content to let his wife handle a dispute that was fundamentally hers to handle, who finally spoke, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried certainty that Josephine had come to recognize as the sound of a decision already settled in his mind. "She's cared for, Mr. Pruitt," Nathaniel said, "by a husband, a sister, a foreman who thinks of her as family, and by an entire town that's about to send its children to a school she built with her own good sense. You rode 1,000 miles twice now to tell a woman who's built more in 18 months than most men build in a lifetime that she doesn't know what's good for her. I'd say that's answer enough for anyone watching." The gathered crowd, Josephine would later learn from a dozen different retellings over the following weeks, had murmured its clear agreement at this, and Wendell Pruitt, recognizing at last that he had no remaining card to play in front of an audience that had turned decisively against him, collected his pale, mortified lawyer and departed Larkspur Hollow on the next available stage, never to trouble the Hollis family again, though word reached them 18 months later, through the same Boston correspondent who had proven so useful throughout the whole affair, that Wendell's own family fortunes had taken a considerable downturn following a series of poor investments, a piece of news Josephine received without satisfaction or malice, only the plain, settled sense of a ledger finally closed. The remainder of that Independence Day unfolded as such gatherings were meant to, with foot races and fiddle music and a genuine warmth toward the Hollis family that Josephine felt settle over her differently than any single conversation or kindness had managed before. The accumulated weight of 18 months of fair dealing finally showing itself in the way neighbors clasped Nathaniel's hand and complimented Josephine on the schoolhouse and asked after Ruth's plans for the coming year, as though the suspicion of the previous winter had simply never existed. Agatha Higgins herself approached Josephine near the end of the afternoon with what appeared to be genuine, if belated, humility, and said that she hoped Mrs. Hollis would forgive an old woman's foolish talk from the previous winter, admitting that she had judged too quickly and too harshly a family that had only ever tried to build something good in a hard place. Josephine, who had long ago decided that holding a grudge was its own kind of bad accounting, accepted the apology with genuine grace, and the two women, over the following years, would develop something that eventually resembled, if not quite friendship, at least a durable mutual respect. The years that followed unfolded in the way years do on a working ranch, marked less by singular dramatic turns than by the steady accumulation of ordinary seasons, and it is in that accumulation, Josephine would come to believe, that the truest measure of a life is finally taken. In the spring of 1881, she gave birth to a daughter, whom she and Nathaniel named Eleanor Ruth Hollis, honoring both Nathaniel's first wife, whose memory Josephine had never asked him to set aside, and Josephine's own sister, whose steady presence had become as much a part of the ranch's foundation as the coal seam or the cattle herds. A second child followed in 1883, a son named Charles Thomas, called Charlie by everyone from the day he was born, in honor of Tom Yarrow, who wept without shame when Nathaniel told him of the naming, and who thereafter considered the boy something very near his own grandson, teaching him to ride and to track and to whittle exactly as he had once taught Ruth. A third child, a daughter named Grace, arrived in 1886, completing a family that Josephine, in the private ledger of her own heart, considered the richest accounting she had ever kept, richer by far than any coal royalty or cattle sale, though she would have been the first to note, with her characteristic dry practicality, that the coal royalties were what had made the raising of 3 healthy children considerably easier than it might otherwise have been. Ruth, for her part, did not marry until 1884, having spent the intervening years first helping Josephine establish the bookkeeping classes, and later, as her own confidence grew, taking on responsibility for managing the schoolhouse's small library and its modest budget for new books, a role that suited her open, curious temperament far better than any life of quiet domesticity might have. When she did marry, it was to a young doctor named Samuel Kestrel, who had come to Larkspur Hollow in 1883 to establish the county's first proper medical practice, and who had, by his own later admission, fallen in love with Ruth Caro during her frequent visits to his office, seeking remedies and advice for the various minor ailments of ranch life. Visits that Josephine suspected, with some private amusement, had grown considerably more frequent than any genuine medical necessity required. Samuel Kestrel proved a steady, gentle man who treated Ruth's easy warmth as a gift rather than a weakness to be managed, and the two settled in a house near the schoolhouse itself, close enough that Ruth remained, for the rest of her days, a near-daily presence in the lives of Josephine's growing children, an aunt who taught them to bake bread and identify tracks in the snow, exactly as Tom Yarrow had once taught her. Tom Yarrow himself remained at Split Rock as foreman for the rest of his working life, never marrying, content, he said more than once, with a family he'd found rather than made for himself. And when age finally slowed him past the point of comfortable ranch work in the early 1890s, Nathaniel and Josephine settled him in a small, well-built cabin near the main house, rather than see him retire to some distant relative's charity, a decision Josephine considered simply the correct entry to make in any fair accounting of what the man had given the family across 15 years of loyal, unglamorous work. He died peacefully in 1897, at the age of 69, having lived long enough to see young Charlie Hollis, by then a capable 14-year-old, take over many of the foreman's own old duties with the herd, a passing of practical knowledge from one generation to the next that Tom had, in his final years, come to consider his own truest legacy, prouder of it, he told Josephine once, than of any single season's roundup. The Widow's Table Mine operated steadily and profitably for over 2 decades, exactly as Elias Whitcomb's original survey had predicted, providing the ranch and, by extension, a good portion of Larkspur Hollow's working families, with a stable income that weathered even the harder cattle markets of the mid-1880s, and the brief but sharp economic panic of 1893, a downturn that broke several ranches across the county but left Split Rock's diversified income relatively secure. Whitcomb himself remained involved in the mine's operation for its first decade before retiring to Cheyenne, a wealthy and well-respected man, and he wrote to Josephine occasionally in his later years, always addressing her, with evident and lasting respect, as the sharpest negotiator he had encountered in 30 years of mining business, a compliment Josephine kept folded inside the cover of her original ledger for the rest of her life, alongside the very first note she had ever corrected in Nathaniel's cattle accounts. Silas Dunmore's General Store struggled increasingly through the 1880s as the Cheyenne Wells Cooperative expanded its reach and as more of the county's ranchers, following the Hollis family's example, began comparing prices and demanding fairer terms rather than accepting whatever a single local merchant chose to charge them. Silas never fully reconciled himself to this shift, remaining, until his death in 1899, a man whose fixed, grasping nature simply found smaller and smaller arenas in which to express itself, though he did, in his final years, grudgingly send his own granddaughter to learn bookkeeping from Josephine's evening classes, a decision he never explained, but that Josephine chose to interpret, generously, as the closest thing to an apology the man was ever likely to offer. Horace Dunmore fared somewhat better, having learned a genuine and lasting lesson from the compounding affair of 1878. His bank, chastened by how narrowly it had avoided a formal examination, adopted considerably more transparent lending practices over the following decade, and Horace himself, in an irony Josephine noted with some private satisfaction, became one of the earliest and most vocal supporters of extending credit to women managing their own farms and small businesses in the county, a policy shift that Prudence Ackerman, among others, benefited from directly when she later sought a loan of her own to expand the Ackerman Farms dairy operation independent of the Hollis Ranch's involvement. Wendell Pruitt's later fortunes, as previously noted, took a considerable downturn following the schoolhouse dedication humiliation, his family's investments souring across the following decade until the once proud Pruitt name carried, by the turn of the century, considerably less weight in Springfield society than it once had. Josephine received, in 1902, a brief and awkwardly worded letter from Wendell himself, then a man well past 50 and evidently humbled by circumstance, offering a sort of oblique apology for his conduct 24 years earlier and asking, with what struck Josephine as genuine rather than calculated humility, whether she might consider corresponding with him occasionally as an old family acquaintance rather than an adversary. Josephine considered the letter carefully for several days before replying with a brief, civil note wishing him well but declining any renewed correspondence, judging that some accounts, however long overdue for settlement, were better simply closed than reopened, a decision she never regretted and rarely thought of again. Agatha Higgins lived to the considerable age of 81, dying peacefully in 1901, and in her final years she had become, to the quiet amusement of everyone who remembered her earlier suspicions, one of the schoolhouse's most devoted supporters, donating her own modest savings toward a small library expansion and attending, without fail, every single graduation ceremony the school held, applauding each departing student with a fervor that suggested she had entirely forgotten, or perhaps simply chosen to set aside, her early conviction that the Hollis family represented some manner of scandal visited upon an unsuspecting town. Josephine attended her funeral, and, standing beside the grave in the crisp autumn air, found herself reflecting that the woman's late-blooming warmth, however tardy, had been genuine in the end, and that genuine warmth, however delayed, was worth more than a lifetime of consistency in the wrong direction. By 1895, Split Rock Ranch had grown to encompass nearly 15,000 acres, folding in 3 more struggling neighboring claims over the years, always at the owner's own request, and always on terms Josephine insisted be fair to the seller rather than merely advantageous to the buyer, a policy that earned the ranch a reputation across the county as the operation to approach when a family found itself in genuine difficulty rather than the one to fear. The schoolhouse Josephine had built in 1880 had, by the turn of the century, grown into a proper 2-room institution serving nearly 60 children each year, with a formally trained teacher paid a genuine salary rather than the modest stipend of its early years. And the bookkeeping classes Josephine had begun in her own kitchen had, by 1898, formalized into a recognized program that had, by Josephine's own careful count, kept in the back of her original ledger, taught proper accounting to over 140 women across the county, several of whom had gone on to manage substantial farms, stores, and even, in 2 notable cases, small banks of their own, women who might otherwise have remained entirely dependent on the fortunes of husbands or fathers for the whole of their lives. Nathaniel Hollis died in the winter of 1908, at the age of 64, from a heart that had simply, quietly, given out one January morning while he was checking on a calving heifer in the north pasture, a death Josephine always considered fitting for a man who had never once, across 30 years of marriage, complained about the work that constituted his life, work he had always seemed to regard not as burden, but as the plain and satisfying business of tending something worth tending. Josephine, 60 years old herself by then and still sharp-minded and steady-handed, continued to manage the ranch's books personally for another 8 years, working alongside her son Charlie, who had by then taken over the practical running of the cattle operation, and her daughter Eleanor, who had inherited her mother's precise mind for figures, and had, by 1910, taken over the coal royalty accounts and the bookkeeping program both. A passing of responsibility from mother to daughter that Josephine considered, in the quiet satisfaction of her later years, the truest fulfillment of everything she had built. Josephine's youngest daughter, Grace, chose a path different from her siblings, leaving Larkspur Hollow in 1904 to study at a women's college back east, a choice Josephine funded without hesitation, and a choice that would once, in the Springfield of Josephine's own girlhood, have marked a young woman as unmarriageable and strange, but that by the turn of the century drew instead a kind of cautious local admiration, the county having watched, across 3 decades, the tangible good that came from a well-educated woman's careful mind. Grace returned in 1909, shortly after her father's death, not to Split Rock itself, but to Larkspur Hollow proper, where she took over as the schoolhouse's head teacher, a position she held for the following 30 years, teaching, by her own eventual estimate, somewhere near 800 children to read and write and cipher in a building her own mother had built from a single season's coal royalty and a stubborn refusal to let a hard year go to waste. It was Grace, in fact, who first suggested, in 1912, that the schoolhouse's newest wing, funded by a further gift from the Hollis family, be named formally the Caro Hollis Hall, a suggestion Josephine initially resisted, uncomfortable with the idea of her own name carved into a building's cornerstone, until Ruth, by then a grandmother herself and still living near the schoolhouse with her husband Samuel, pointed out gently that the town's children deserved to know whose stubbornness and whose arithmetic had built the roof over their heads, so that some among them, faced with their own hard winters some day, might remember that a person's circumstances at the start of a story were rarely the whole of what that story would become. Charlie Hollis married in 1907 to a rancher's daughter from the next county over named Dorothea Finch, a steady, capable young woman whom Josephine liked immediately for her plain-spoken practicality, a quality Josephine had come to value above nearly any other across her own long life. Charlie and Dorothea raised 4 children at Split Rock, continuing the cattle operation their father had built and their mother had rescued from debt and drought both, and it was Charlie's eldest son, a boy named Nathaniel Thomas Hollis, after both his grandfather and the foreman who had helped raise his own father, who would eventually, in the 1920s, expand the ranch's operations further still, introducing new grazing rotation methods learned from the Territorial Agricultural Extension Service, methods that Josephine, by then in her 70s, reviewed with the same careful, unshowy scrutiny she had once applied to a young rancher's cattle ledger by lamplight, pronouncing them sound after several evenings spent working through the projected numbers herself, a habit she never fully surrendered even in her final years. Eleanor, Josephine's eldest, remained the child most visibly cut from her mother's own cloth, marrying relatively late, at 29, to a quiet, competent mining engineer named Walter Bishop, who had come to manage the widow's table operation after Elias Whitcomb's retirement, a marriage born, much like Josephine's own, less from immediate passion than from a deep and steadily growing mutual respect between two people who each recognized in the other a rare seriousness of purpose. Eleanor took over full management of both the mine's accounts and the county's bookkeeping education program by 1915, expanding the latter, in a development that would have seemed almost impossible in the Larkspur Hollow of 1878, into a modest but genuine correspondence course that reached women across 3 counties who could never travel to Larkspur Hollow itself, a project Eleanor pursued with a quiet, patient thoroughness that anyone who had known her mother's own early years at Split Rock would have recognized instantly. Josephine herself remained a familiar and respected figure in Larkspur Hollow well into her old age, walking with a cane in her final decade, but refusing, until nearly the very end, to give up her habit of reviewing the ranch's accounts personally each quarter, a ritual her children and grandchildren indulged with the particular affectionate patience families reserve for a matriarch whose judgment has, across the whole of living memory, never once been proven unsound. She was present in 1918 for the 40th anniversary of the schoolhouse's founding, an occasion the town marked with a genuine and heartfelt ceremony rather than the sort of hollow civic ritual such anniversaries often become, and she was asked, that afternoon, to say a few words to the gathered crowd of former students, current students, and 3 generations of families whose lives had passed, in one way or another, through the building's doors. She spoke briefly, in the plain, unadorned style that had never left her across 40 years of prosperity, saying only that she had arrived in this county on the worst night of her life, half frozen and certain she was about to die on a road she could no longer see, and that everything the town now stood on, in her own accounting of it, had grown from the simple, stubborn refusal to sit down in the snow when sitting down would have been so much easier. She said that a coal seam and a corrected banknote and a schoolhouse full of books were not, in the end, the true legacy of that terrible night, but only the visible proof of it, the actual legacy being harder to hold in the hand. The plain fact that a person's worth was never fixed by the circumstances that delivered them somewhere, only by what they chose to build once they arrived, and that every child sitting in front of her that afternoon, whatever hard road had brought their own family to this valley, carried the same choice inside them that she herself had carried, cold and frightened, on a December night 40 years before. Josephine Hollis died in the spring of 1921, at the age of 67, in the same small back bedroom off the main house where she and Ruth had first slept, cold and grateful and alive, on the night Nathaniel Hollis rode out into a snow squall to find them. She was buried beside Nathaniel in the small cemetery behind the schoolhouse she had built, her headstone, at her own quietly insistent instruction, laid out in her will, bearing no mention of the coal mine or the ranch's 15,000 acres, only her name, her dates, and a single line she had chosen herself years earlier. She kept the accounts honest. Ruth, who outlived her sister by 11 years, told anyone who asked that the words meant considerably more than they appeared to on their surface, that Josephine had kept honest not merely the ranch's ledgers, but the whole accounting of a life, what was owed, what was given, what was earned, and what, in the end, was simply passed forward to whoever came next. The years after Josephine's death did nothing to diminish what she had built, and in some ways revealed its true durability more clearly than her own lifetime had allowed. Charlie Hollis continued running Split Rock's cattle operation until his own death in 1934, at which point his son Nathaniel Thomas, by then a capable man of 26 with his grandfather's steady temperament and, by all accounts, a fair measure of his grandmother's careful arithmetic besides, took over full management of the ranch, guiding it through the hardest years of the drought and depression that broke so many other operations across the territory during the 1930s. The ranch survived those years, as it had survived the drought of 1878, on the strength of the same principle Josephine had instilled from her earliest months at Split Rock: diversified income, honest accounting, and a refusal to borrow against a future the family could not clearly see. The coal mine, though its most productive seams had thinned by the late 1920s, had by then already funded 3 generations of expansion and education, and Walter Bishop's careful stewardship, followed by that of his and Eleanor's own son, ensured the operation wound down gradually and responsibly rather than collapsing suddenly and leaving a generation of miners without work or warning, a courtesy Josephine herself had insisted upon decades earlier, when the original partnership terms were first drawn up with Elias Whitcomb. The schoolhouse, expanded twice more across the 20th century, eventually became the anchor of a proper county school district, and the Caro Hollis Hall wing that Grace had first proposed in 1912 still stood, considerably renovated but structurally sound, well into the 1960s, its cornerstone bearing the names of both sisters exactly as Ruth had once insisted it should. Grace herself taught until 1939, retiring at the age of 53 after 30 years at the school's helm, and she lived to see, in her own final years, several of her earliest students' grandchildren pass through the very same classrooms, a continuity she found more moving, she told her nieces and nephews more than once, than any single accomplishment of her own long career. The bookkeeping correspondence course Eleanor had built continued under various forms and various names for decades after Eleanor's own retirement in 1938, eventually folding, in the 1950s, into a more formal home economics and business curriculum offered through the expanded county school system, though longtime residents of Larkspur Hollow, well into the middle of the 20th century, still referred to any woman skilled with a household or business ledger as having gone through the Hollis classes, regardless of whether she had studied under Josephine herself, under Eleanor, or under one of the many women each of them had in turn trained to teach others. Ruth Caro Kestrel lived until 1932, dying peacefully in her own bed at the age of 71, having spent her final years exactly as she had spent most of her life, surrounded by nieces and nephews and grandnieces and grandnephews who called her, without exception, the warmest person any of them had ever known, a reputation built across 5 decades of small, artless kindnesses that had never once required the careful strategic calculation her sister brought to nearly everything else. She was buried beside her husband Samuel, a short walk from Josephine and Nathaniel's own graves, and it became something of a tradition among the Hollis and Kestrel descendants both to visit both graves together each spring, a practice that continued for generations and that served, whether the visiting descendants fully understood it or not, as a kind of living reminder that the family's fortune had been built by two sisters working in their own separate, complementary ways, rather than by any single heroic figure acting alone. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of the two Caro sisters who had nearly frozen to death on the road to Split Rock Ranch in December of 1878 had passed, in the particular way such stories do in small communities, from lived memory into something closer to local legend, told and retold at county fairs and church socials, and, eventually, written down more formally by a great-granddaughter of Ruth's, a school teacher herself, who compiled the family's letters and ledgers into a modest, privately printed history in 1958, drawing heavily on Josephine's own meticulously kept records, which had survived, remarkably intact, in a cedar chest in the Split Rock Ranch house. The very same chest, family memory insisted, though this detail proved impossible to confirm with full certainty, that had once belonged to Nathaniel's first wife Eleanor, passed down and repurposed and refilled across 3 generations, until it held not one woman's modest belongings, but an entire family's accumulated proof of what patient, honest work could build across a single stubborn lifetime. The land itself, through every generation of Hollis descendants who worked it, retained the 2 features that had marked it from that first terrible night in 1878. The boulder beside Cutler Creek, where Nathaniel Hollis had found 2 frozen, exhausted sisters sheltering from a squall that very nearly killed them both. And the long, pale ridge of Widow's Table, rising above the north pasture, its exposed, coal-bearing strata, visible to anyone who knew to look for the dark banding Josephine had first noticed with a half-frozen mind, and a father's old geological notes carried 1,100 miles in a carpet bag. Descendants of the family, well into the 20th century, made a quiet habit of pointing out the boulder to visiting children on the ranch, telling them, in whatever version of the story suited the child's age, that a stubborn woman had once refused to let her sister sit down in the snow beside that very rock, and that everything else, the schoolhouse, the mine, the 15,000 acres, the generations of women who had learned to keep their own honest accounts, because one woman had once kept hers, had grown, however improbably, from that single refusal. The ranch passed, in 1971, to a 4th generation of Hollis descendants, a great-grandson of Charlie's named Robert Hollis, who inherited alongside the land itself a considerable weight of family expectation and a set of ledgers, still kept in the old style Josephine had established nearly a century earlier, that Robert's own mother had insisted be maintained by hand well into an era when most ranching operations of comparable size had long since turned to more modern methods of accounting. Robert modernized the operation considerably over the following 2 decades, introducing improved cattle breeds and updated irrigation drawn from a reservoir built in the 1960s along Cutler Creek itself. But he kept, at his mother's quiet but firm insistence, one small and deliberately old-fashioned practice: a framed page from Josephine's original 1878 ledger, the very page on which she had first shown Nathaniel the grain price discrepancy that had opened the door to everything that followed. Hung in the ranch office where every foreman and every family member who worked the books could see it. A reminder, Robert's mother told him more than once, that the whole of the family's fortune had begun not with the coal or the cattle, but with a young woman's willingness to look honestly and carefully at numbers other people had been too busy or too careless to examine. The town of Larkspur Hollow itself grew, across the 20th century, from the small, isolated settlement Josephine had first ridden into on a mule-drawn wagon into a proper county seat of several thousand residents, its main street eventually paved and lined with businesses that bore little resemblance to Silas Dunmore's cramped general store or Horace Dunmore's single-brick bank. Though the schoolhouse Josephine had built, expanded and modernized many times over, remained standing on its original half-acre lot well into the 21st century. Its oldest surviving wing, the Caro Hollis Hall, granted formal historical landmark status by the state in 1985. A designation the current generation of Hollis and Kestrel descendants attended the ceremony for in numbers that filled 3 full pews of the county courthouse. An unbroken thread of family stretching back, in an unbroken and carefully documented line, to 2 frozen, frightened sisters who had very nearly not survived their first night in the territory at all. What endured longest, though, longer even than the mine's productive years or the schoolhouse's original walls, was the quieter tradition Josephine had begun almost as an afterthought in the winter of 1879. Women teaching other women to read their own figures honestly, to understand exactly what they owned and exactly what they owed, so that no misfortune of birth or marriage or circumstance would ever again leave a capable woman entirely at the mercy of someone else's arithmetic. That tradition, renamed and reorganized many times across a century of changing institutions, survived in some form through every decade that followed, eventually becoming by the late 20th century a modest scholarship fund administered by the County Historical Society in Josephine Caro Hollis's name, awarded each year to a young woman from a struggling ranching or farming family pursuing education in business or agricultural management. A fund whose founding documents, drawn up by Eleanor's own granddaughter in 1962, quoted directly from a line Josephine herself had written in the back pages of her very first ledger, decades before anyone thought to preserve her words for posterity, that a woman who could balance her own accounts, in every sense the word allowed, need never again depend entirely on the kindness or the honesty of anyone else to determine the shape of her own life. It was this scholarship, more than the coal royalties or the 15,000 acres, or even the schoolhouse itself, that Josephine's family came to regard, across the generations that followed her, as the truest measure of what she had built at Split Rock Ranch. Not a fortune, though a fortune had certainly grown from her efforts, and not merely a family's comfortable security, though that too had followed in due course, but a durable, transferable method, patient, honest, unglamorous, for turning a single desperate night's survival into a lifetime's worth of building, and then into something that could outlive any single lifetime altogether, passed hand to hand and ledger to ledger, down through daughters and granddaughters and strangers who had never known Josephine Caro at all, except through the careful, stubborn habits of mind she had left behind for them to inherit. There is a particular kind of winter evening at Split Rock, even now, when the wind comes down off Widow's Table exactly as it did on the night Josephine Caro first arrived in the territory, rattling the same stretch of fence line, though the fence itself has been rebuilt a dozen times over across a century and a half, and carrying the same bitter cold across the same bottomland where 2 frightened sisters once believed, for the length of 1 terrible hour, that they had walked as far as they were ever going to walk. On such evenings, the current generation of the family, Robert Hollis's own grandchildren now, 6th in the line from Nathaniel and Josephine both, sometimes still walk down to the boulder by Cutler Creek before supper, the same worn gray stone that has never been moved and never been marked with any plaque or marker, because the family long ago decided that a story like this one did not need brass or granite to be remembered properly, only the plain fact of the land itself, still standing, still worked, still passed carefully from one honest pair of hands to the next. Josephine herself, in the last entry she ever made in her private notebook, written some months before her death in 1921, in a hand grown shaky but still perfectly legible, wrote only this, that she had come west expecting to survive a marriage of convenience, and had instead built a life she would not have traded for any other, not because the hardships had been few, for they had not, but because every hardship, faced honestly and worked through patiently, had left behind something more durable than the difficulty itself, a corrected ledger, a repaired fence, a schoolhouse wall, a daughter who could read her own figures without fear, a sister who never stopped laughing even after everything the 2 of them had survived together. She wrote that she hoped whoever eventually read those words, whether child or grandchild, or some stranger long after her own death, would understand that the true accounting of a life was never kept in dollars or acres or even in coal seams pulled from beneath a stubborn ridge of pale limestone, but in the plain, unglamorous sum of what a person chose to build, patiently and honestly, out of whatever hard circumstance first delivered them to their own particular boulder beside their own particular creek, on their own particular night, when the snow seemed determined to take everything, and did not. That notebook, along with the framed ledger page in the ranch office and the plain gray headstone behind the schoolhouse bearing only a name, 2 dates, and 5 quiet words, remain at Split Rock still, tended by descendants who never met the woman who wrote them, but who have grown up, each in turn, hearing the same story told the same essential way. That on the worst night of her life, a young woman refused to sit down in the snow, and that everything else, the mine and the ranch and the schoolhouse, and the century and a half of women who learned to read their own figures because of her, followed from that single refusal the way a river follows the lowest ground, inevitable only in hindsight, earned every difficult mile of the way. The mine's final closure came in 1968, 90 years almost to the month after Elias Whitcomb first climbed the ridge with his sample bags and his careful instruments, and the family marked the occasion not with mourning, but with a modest gathering of the mine's last remaining workers and their families, held in the very schoolhouse Josephine had funded with the operation's first royalty check nearly a century earlier. Robert Hollis's mother, by then an elderly woman herself, and the last living link to those who had known Charlie and Eleanor personally, spoke briefly at that gathering, recalling how her own grandmother Josephine had insisted, from the very first negotiations with Whitcomb back in 1878, that the mine's eventual closure be handled with the same fairness as its opening, a promise the family had kept across 3 generations of ownership, ensuring that every miner who retired or was let go in those final years received a fair pension and, where needed, help finding work elsewhere in the county, rather than being simply released into hardship the moment the coal ran thin. It was, several of the older miners remarked that afternoon, exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous decency the whole Hollis family had become known for across the decades, a reputation built not from any single grand gesture, but from a century of small, careful choices made the same patient way Josephine had once balanced a column of figures, honestly, thoroughly, and without ever cutting a corner, simply because no one was watching closely enough to notice. Cora Beeman, Ruth's first friend in the territory and one of the earliest students of Josephine's bookkeeping classes, lived long enough herself to see her own granddaughter graduate from the very schoolhouse the 2 families had watched rise from bare ground in 1879, and she told a local newspaper reporter, in an interview conducted for the town's centennial celebration in 1978, exactly 100 years after that first terrible snow squall, that she had known from her very first conversation with Ruth Caro, 2 frightened girls talking about horses in her father's livery stable, that something remarkable had arrived in Larkspur Hollow, though she admitted, with a laugh the reporter noted was still bright and quick, even in her old age, that she could never have guessed, back in that cold winter of 1878, exactly how far the ripples of that one snowbound arrival would eventually travel, through generations of women neither she nor Josephine would ever personally meet, each one taught, in her own turn, to keep her own accounts honest, and to never, under any circumstance, sit down in the snow simply because sitting down would have been easier than the walk still left ahead of her. Nathaniel Thomas Hollis, the grandson who had modernized the ranch's grazing methods in the 1920s, kept, until his own death in 1979, a small leather-bound copy of his grandmother's geological pamphlets, the very ones Josephine had carried 1,100 miles from Springfield in a carpet bag, and he would sometimes show them to visiting relatives or curious neighbors, turning the soft, worn pages with the particular reverence of a man handling something considerably more valuable than its physical condition suggested. He told his own children that the pamphlets mattered less for the geology they described, most of which had long since been superseded by more modern surveying methods, than for what they represented about the woman who had read them until the pages went soft. A mind that refused to accept the limits other people assumed for her. Whether those limits came from a grieving rancher's low expectations of a mail-order bride, a grasping merchant's assumption that a woman new to the territory would simply accept whatever price he cared to charge, or a banker's quiet confidence that no one would ever bother checking his arithmetic closely enough to catch the difference between annual and monthly compounding. Each of those assumptions, Nathaniel Thomas would tell his children, had been proven wrong by the same careful, patient method. Not confrontation for its own sake, but simply looking closely and honestly at what was actually true, and then acting on that truth without apology or hesitation. A lesson the family continued to pass down long after anyone could remember exactly which ancestor had first articulated it in quite those words. Though everyone agreed it had almost certainly been Josephine herself, sometime in that first hard winter of 1878, when survival itself had still been very much in question. Every spring, when the last of the snow finally pulls back from Cutler Creek and the water runs high and clear again past the old gray boulder, the ground beneath Widow's table turns green, first along the lowest draws, exactly as it always has, exactly as it did before anyone named Hollis or Caro ever set foot on it. And the ridge stands pale and patient above the ranch, holding its long empty seams, its work finished, its part of the story told, while the land it once fed goes on quietly being worked by hands that remember, however distantly, whose hands first taught it fairness.